the first session of the day, and our chair for this session is Brother Wofo from Cameroon, the indomitable lion of West Africa. Over to you, sir.
Hotel. Excuse my English. I don't want to leave another colonialist language for another. I don't want to learn more English. Abarigani. Yesterday was a beautiful day, and in Africa we say today will be better. And we will hear in this morning 4 people: Dr. Wizi Gumede, Dr. Munguni, Sister Afwa, and Dr. Ajiza Albekulan for Sunday. Dr. Wizi Gumede of University of South Africa, and the subject is Advancing African Leadership, True Leadership and True Liberation for Africa's Development. Dr. Gumede.
What's up? Thanks, moderator, and good morning, everyone. It feels good to be here in the midst of greatness and the discussions that are taking place. Very fulfilling. I was telling my colleagues in South Africa yesterday that I feel renewed. Yes. My Africanness and Afrocentricity being renewed, which is greatly appreciated. I'm going to talk about advancing African leadership, and in particular focus on critical consciousness and thought liberation. And I'm going to say a lot more about this as I present. All of this in the context of African Renaissance, the further renewal of the African continent. As an introduction or as background, we know that we have many challenges still in the African continent, and I think the starting point is useful to always acknowledge these challenges. First of all, contrary to what others make us to believe, particularly in the North, that Africa is rising because they want to use that for their own interests. Some of us argue that actually Africa is not rising in that narrative, in that sense, in the narrative that is being presented. Many people in Africa still face many challenges. There are still challenges of poverty, challenges related to inequality, and we've seen what has happened, for instance, in Southern Africa, particularly South Africa recently, around xenophobic attacks. So first of all, we think there is still poor economic development, although many argue that Africa is growing and is rising. We think the reason for this poor economic development in the African continent is that we have borrowed the policies. The policies that we implement in the African continent are borrowed policies, and we can talk more specifically about Sub-Saharan Africa here. Maybe that's politically incorrect to say here, but we know that the structural adjustment programs that were implemented by the World Bank and IMF made us lose a lot of ground in the African continent when we gained traction with advancing well-being in terms of education, healthcare. These structural adjustment programs meant that we couldn't spend anymore in those areas, or we couldn't spend sufficiently, and therefore lost traction again. We know that we rely a lot in natural resources, and unfortunately it's not just the reliance, is that we export raw materials and import an expensive, exorbitant prices finished products, and we don't do our own manufacturing. We know the reason for that. Samira and many others have made a point why this is happening. It's largely because the way Africa, as they argue, connected with the rest of the world was inappropriate. It was through slave trade and other such passive instances. Thirdly, and most importantly for me, I think that we do not have our own economic development philosophy, or we've lost it. So again, this point about borrowing from others. Most of the policies we pursue come from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, of course sponsored by Americans and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And we think this, of course, is problematic because these models of development are neoliberal, as many have said, capitalistic, and are contrary, some of us argue, to our ways of life as Africans. We've been arguing and reflecting a bit about this, advancing what we call communalism, going back to Walter Rodney, where he described the manner in which our social and economic life was organized before colonialism, and that was along the lines of communalism, and not communism, and not Marxism. Communalism, just to be very explicit, and we're elaborating this approach because we think there's a lot more to learn from that. And that's, of course, the challenge of implementation, which we all take for granted. We have social problems. I just alluded to the xenophobic attacks in Africa, in South Africa, and we know the reasons for this. And some of us have argued that largely this has to do with political inequality in Southern Africa and in South Africa. So you have a large number of people who are seen to be progressing fast economically through political patronage, whilst the rest of the communities are unable to catch up, and they are not being taken care of by social policy, and therefore scrambling for resources, and people visit the injustice to those that they can quickly reach, in this case those that they live with. As one of us has suggested, that the other enemy, we know who's the enemy, but we visit injustice amongst each other. Again, it has to do with colonialism, as we all understand how we are a wounded people, as Amazon said, we're damaged people, and there's certain aspects of self-hate, self-hatred that we need to address. We know about our educational challenges. We had discussion during lunch with some colleagues here in Zimbabwe yesterday. About this same challenge. South Africa, of course, a very big challenge in many other countries around the comes, and then we've got this challenge of civil wars, which again we know they are sponsored, they benefit other interests. Sudan, for instance, that Molefik Dassan spoke about yesterday, and we can talk of many cases where there is war, civil war, because it's sponsored by the North. Americans in particular, and some in Europe, because they benefit from that. Of course, the African International has explained why we remain in the periphery and what we need to do, and in particular that we need to raise our level of consciousness. It has to start with raising our level of consciousness, because, as some of us argue, what colonialism has done has made us to have what we call destructive thought patterns and behaviors. These are not our ways of life, but we've learned these wrong things, and we need to unlearn, as some of us will argue. And of course, lastly, the last issue around leadership. And this applies, we'll argue, globally, not just in Africa. Some of us argue that the problem we're facing globally, and particularly with regards to the global economy, the reason we ended up with a global economic recession, which has affected Africa severely, which of course originated in the United States, as many have argued and demonstrated, is that the leadership we have globally is not critically conscious, is not mentally free, and therefore we end up with these challenges. Essentially, we need to be challenging that paradigm, and we need to change the way we approach economics and politics. Quickly on leadership, because my talk is on leadership, I think the point I want to highlight here in the main is that leadership has also to do with responsibility than privileges. In many instances, our leaders, particularly in the political sphere, think mainly in terms of privileges. And I think we do want to emphasize that as a leader, you also have the responsibilities. The reason you come to high office, for instance, is in order that you can advance well-being, and in our context, as in the continent of Africa, it must be about advancing the human condition in our own continent. But they normally think of privileges, which is a challenge that we face. Of course, there are exceptions that we can talk about here, and I'm going to say something about those. With regards to African leadership, I'm suggesting this definition that it must be a leadership that's centered on Afrocentric histories. It has to be centered on Afrocentric philosophies, epistemologies, and other Pan-Africanist orientation or ideologies, as well as respect for African cultures. And I emphasize the respect. Though culture evolves and has evolved and has been interfered with, has been under assault, as we might put it, that we need to respect the ways of life of the people. Often we, as people become leaders, tend to think they know better and they can think of better projects for community development, as an example, whereas the people have a different view because they function differently. In many instances that are documented of this, where people could have approached development differently. Claude Ake wrote a lot about this during his time. Why development is not taking place in the African continent, because we impose it on the people rather than working with the people or listening or allowing the people to do development themselves. With regards to thought leadership, the definition I'm suggesting here, and I've written a bit on this, is that it has to be based on progressive ideologies. It has to be based on progressive beliefs and orientations that have a significant pragmatic and impact appeal for positive change in the African continent. It has to be about bringing about positive change in the African continent. Now, we know a lot about this, all of us, that in the past 500 years, there have been a lot of changes, largely because of colonialism or the colonial experience. And this has affected our governance systems in the African continent. I think someone has already emphasized the point, the centrality of the role of women in leadership, in decision making in Africa, which no longer happens. And these changes that have taken place in the past 500 years, of course, have affected our own leadership approaches or leadership styles, and also is related to neglect or marginalization of our own approaches to leadership in the global discourses of leadership. The colonial experience and the development of the post-colonial state, and we emphasize here the post-colonial state because we see a continuation largely of colonialism, have impacted on the systems of leadership in the African societies in a negative way. And lastly, the changes and shifts that have been taking place in power relations have, of course, impacted the various roles in leadership or decision-making in our continent, and in particular, the point around women, the central role that they played in the various kingdoms and empires. So we need to reclaim our lost glory. We do know that we are a great people, we've always been a great people, not what we are told. We know that we've produced great thought leaders in our continent. And by the way, the point must be made that leaders are an outcome, as historians would put it, are an outcome of the context and are given that authority to lead by the people. And we've done this, we've produced great leaders in the past, before colonialism. If you think of what we could call pre-colonial kingdoms and empires, and I list quite a number of these thinkers and leaders. Also in the post-colonial period, or the post-independent era, a lot of great leaders, and I list a number of them here, that have actually come up with innovative, come up with sound ways of leading, of decision making, and we do need to acknowledge that. And it's also very important for us as Africans to acknowledge that we've had numerous heroic resistances to imperial advances. I list quite a few here that we should be really proud of. For instance, the 1896 Adwa victory by Ethiopians, which we are told through its inspiration from the 1879 Imbi Yasisandran victory. And we know there are many others. The one that I talk a lot about when I discuss with my students this area, I teach African political economy, is the Khoi Khoi victory, which is not well documented and sufficiently discussed in what we know today as Cape Town, where the Khoi in 1510 successfully resisted the Portuguese. And the most important issue about this resistance is that we were able, with very minimal ammunition, artillery, whereas the colonialists were coming very well armed, but we're able, through wisdom, ingenuity, strategy, to defeat many colonialists. And of course, it's important to acknowledge also that we've had very advanced knowledge production institutions far before colonialism. The most that are written about, of course, are Walata and Timbuktu. And I think this should be our source of glory, source of inspiration as we reclaim our lost glory. Very quickly, I've already defined what I think African leadership is, and the point is made that the new generation of African leaders must be grounded in African history. I think this point has come up again and again, that of course we need to be very conscious of our own civilization, that we brought civilization to humanity, but also we've got a very proud history as Africans, and we do need to know this history well. And we need to immerse ourselves into the African archive. A lot of that's been written, some people in this room anyway have written extensively about our own history, and I think it's important for us that we immerse ourselves deliberately to that archive and historiography. And of course, the new generation of African leaders must be intellectually oriented towards deliberate search for relevant knowledge. We need relevant knowledge, we need to challenge existing paradigms, and we argue part of that will be through dot liberation and dot leadership. Now, while a normal leader, as we will expect, need to have an ability or abilities to listen, to communicate, to influence that follow him or her, to achieve the goals. A thought leader has to be somebody who possesses the right kind of knowledge to advance new thinking and inspire others, as well as enhance deliverables aimed at positive change. So in the context of advancing African leadership, we'll argue that it's important to know, first of all, where we come from, what has happened over the time, acknowledge and fully understand the historical experience of colonialism, imperialism, slave trade, and all these many ugly things, to help us to address the challenge that we face. Because if we don't fully understand that, we're unlikely to address the challenge. So for instance, in many instances, people will lament corruption without thinking about what are the basis, what is the historical understanding of what has happened with ourselves as Africans and what has happened on us, and actually also who's actually benefiting from this corruption. We know there are the narratives from the Euro-American imperialist perspectives, but we will disagree, of course, with those. And lastly, that the point I've made about thought leadership, that it has to be underpinned by unconventional ideological or philosophical orientation, historically nuanced, again, or keep emphasizing this issue of history, understanding of history, cultural sensitivity, because culture is extremely important, and also contextually grounded in a sense that where you are, it's important to better understand that context. And of course, this means you listen to the people, you have a lot to learn from the people themselves as a leader, opposite or contrary to what most of our leaders tend to believe. And of course, critical consciousness is very critical, not just for our leaders, but I think for all of us and the citizenry in the African continent, and those of African descent, because to hold our leaders accountable, for instance, we need to be critically conscious, but also to bring about change, to challenge existing paradigms, to think of better ways to advance our well-being. We do need critical consciousness, and I use Paul Freire here to define or to conceptualize what is critical consciousness, and he puts it as learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions, and to take action. I think we should underline that, to take action against oppressive elements of reality. And this critical consciousness should be linked to decolonizing our minds, as Chinua Achebe made the same point, Young, Chinwezi, many others, and of course, here in the Afrocentricity intentionally been emphasizing the same points. And lastly, and most importantly, knowledge production is critical, should be a critical factor to advancing the further renewal of the African continent. So we need to write, we need to document, because without producing particularly new knowledges, we may not be successful. I think we'll all agree that there's a case for thought leadership because of our precarious position in the global affairs as Africans, and also that the Africa's experiences are inextricably linked to the injustices of the past, slave trade, colonialism, and so forth. And nowadays, of course, we do deal with new imperialist agendas as well as coloniality. Coloniality in the sense that the world is hierarchical, so it's not by chance that Africa is in the periphery or in the bottom. It's in the interest of others that Africa remains at the bottom so that they can continue to plunder, exploit, and do whatever they feel about Africa and Africans. Tadiam Kandawiri makes an interesting point in his recent paper, Running Whilst Others Walk, that what the imperialists or new imperialists do is that when they see that you are making progress or Africa is making progress, they find ways to interfere with that. And if tactical ways don't work, they bomb you. And this is a formulation from his paper. They bomb you back into the Stone Age. So it's very serious. And then, of course, these challenges continue to shape Africa's social, psychosocial, economic, and political realities to this day. And development is quite critical, and I think of development within the context of what the Bandung Conference conceptualized. And I'm not going to all that detail as time is probably running out. In conclusion, so for us to move forward faster, we are moving. So if you look back, arguably there is progress. Not as fast, of course. In the past 10 years, some of us argue we've lost traction as Africans on the African continent. But still, there have been some gains or areas that we should be proud of. So, to move faster forward with the agenda of African Renaissance, the rebirth of the African continent, and also with the philosophy of Pan-Africanism within, of course, the Afrocentric paradigm. Critical consciousness, or critically conscious and mentally liberated thought leaders. Mentally liberated in the sense that we unlearn the destructive thought patterns and behaviors that we see in ourselves, we observe in ourselves, and that people in general need to be critically conscious and also mentally liberated. A thought leader, as I indicated, we need to be aware of our own histories. We need to be ready to challenge known paradigms of current thoughts, and I think the world seems to me to be desperate for an alternative paradigm. If you think in the economic sphere, in the area where I research and write, we've exhausted all economic approaches that we think will take humanity forward. And there's a sense that we need to be thinking of a different approach. Hence, some of us have been looking far back before colonialism, how actually we lived, how we organized, how our communities functioned, and Walter Rodney, of course, called that communalism, to see whether there are aspects of that that we can bring forward and what kind of an approach we should be pursuing as Africans. We need to be open to be shaped and corrected by the people. This is more so for our leaders, where in a sense they don't allow themselves to listen to the people. They end up with wrong decisions, which don't take ourselves forward. And lastly, that we need to be key role players in creating and disseminating knowledges. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Vuzi Gumede. Vuzigumede is the Shenuchi, is one of Shenuchi of South Africa, Afrocentricity South Africa. And be Afrocentric is to be a leader, like you say. The next is Dr. Pasquale Mungweni of University of South Africa. Pasquale Mungweni.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Let me first of all thank the organizers for inviting me to talk on this topic. When I got the invite, I didn't know how they came to nominate me to speak. So I just trusted. I did not remember. I only remember the name from the Faculty of Arts at USAID, but to put the face and the name together, I couldn't. But I was very happy to come back to meet. I knew I would meet a number of colleagues that I went to school with and taught with at USAID and GZU. So it was an opportunity to come back home. Now, without wasting much time, I will speak to you as an African philosopher. So you will forgive me for probably theorizing too much. But I think it is in the theory that everything begins. Now, the title of my paper is Africa Know Thyself, Epistemic Injustice and the Quest for an African Renaissance. Now, the paper focuses on the African Renaissance and the question of epistemic injustice. And the attempt is to revisit the place and the role of the African knowing subject in shaping Africa's future. Now, the injunction, Africa Know Thyself, is carefully selected to highlight the need by Africans to grasp the distinctive particularity of their history as a people of equal ontological standing with the rest of the world. So in this paper, I argue that the possibility of an African Renaissance depends in part on the ability by Africa to reconstitute itself as a legitimate center of knowing. That also entails confronting epistemic injustice, as well as dismantling the mythic foundations that continue to sustain it. Rather than being taken as a misplaced desire to march forward to the past, because the African Renaissance, for me, represents an attempt to reinscribe the past in the present in order to help Africa redefine and reconfigure its own unfolding modernity. Now, in this work, I conceive the African Renaissance as constituting what I call the reality of tomorrow. At different levels and from different angles, Africa needs to confront what I call the vestiges of colonialism, particularly the enduring consequences of the myth of emptiness. Now, I assume that because not many of us are philosophers, the myth of emptiness, I will just define it a little bit. Now, the myth of emptiness is a myth that was founded on two basic levels. It was pronounced on Africa as a geographical entity. That is, that Africa is an empty place, it doesn't belong to anybody. So on that basis, people were able to divide it among themselves, feeling no guilt about it, or having no ethical qualms about dividing a continent that belonged to certain people. So the presupposition was, it is devoid of people, so we can go ahead and parcel it amongst ourselves. Then the second myth was pronounced on the Africans at the more fundamental level, the level of reason. In other words, the Africans were devoid of reasons, and being subject devoid of reasons, they could not therefore belong to the category of human beings. And for that reason, anything could be done on them because they were not part and parcel of those who deserve dignity. So it is important to remember that colonialism and its practice in Africa was premised on the metaphysical denial of the historicity of African peoples, and therefore on the myth of emptiness. Now, let me move to the African Renaissance. I have looked at the term African Renaissance, and as a philosopher, it is always important to be clear about the concepts that we are using, But I shall not dwell much on that because I think we are all aware of what it means. Now, I shall not trace the historical origins of the African Renaissance as an idea, save to acknowledge that luminaries in Africa, such as Sam, Ethiop, Senghor, Nkrumah, Mandela, among others, have shared a vision of a renewed Africa. Now, the term Renaissance for me speaks to the vision that Africans have about the future of the continent. It defines the direction that most believe Africa and Africans must take in order to achieve prosperity at all levels, from the political, social, cultural, to the epistemic front, which I'm going to talk about. Of course, questions have been raised concerning the appropriateness of borrowing a European concept, which is Renaissance, to define such an important African movement, and Ramos does raise these issues. However, for me, without in any way endorsing what we call mimetic philo-practice, it is at the same time crucial to remember that the deployment of European concepts in pursuit of African cause is not something new or intrinsically evil or overly debilitating. Cultures from time immemorial have borrowed ideas from each other, although for some reason others have tried to frantically to deny and conceal their indebtedness to other cultures in the hope of projecting epistemic self-sufficiency and originality. Now, conditions that brought about Pan-Africanism and the struggle for freedom are still prevalent, and they need a new galvanizing vision and dream capable of replicating the passion and the solidarity that united Africans against colonialism. Now, it is true that utopian dreams can be the cause of positive action. Legume reminds us that only those who are unfamiliar with political history scoff at romanticization, because those who don't dare to dream have no glimpse of what the future holds. So I would want Africans to dream as much as they can. Those who have read European history would remember that the encyclopedists who shaped the French Revolution dreamt of the equality of men and their natural born rights at a time when feudal Europe was ruled by despotic kings and selfish aristocratic classes. Today, what they dreamt of is what the modern generation regards as the defining character and nature of the Western society. But at the point of their dream, men dismiss their views as wild imagination. So all we need to do now is to arm ourselves with the conscience needed for African revival. And as is always said, conscience is always a form of power. It drives action. Most Africans share the passion to see Africa change. Passion is what provides the energy needed for an idea to take shape. But the question is, how can that passion be translated into action or reality? And my answer lies in striving to know who we are and the contribution we have made and continue to make to the world. Once we underline who we are and begin to appreciate the contributions that we've made to world civilization, then I think we'll be laying the foundation upon which Africa can take off. I move on to the injunction, African know thyself. Now, the famous African philosopher, Wiredu, summed up his argument for conceptual decolonization in Africa by stating, and I quote, "Conceptually speaking, the maxim of the moment should be African know thyself." Now, the significance of this maxim to me represents the significance of this maxim to the present and the future generations of Africa cannot be overstated. African know thyself is supposedly a derivation of the famous ancient Greek saying, know thyself, controversially attributed to Socrates. Although scholars of African historical reconstruction have now traced its origins to Africa, where it was a common inscription on Egyptian mystic temples addressed to neophytes.
That's right.
And here I'm referring to John Chance. Now, in ancient Greek philosophy, self-knowledge was often considered the panacea to wisdom, the light towards an honest happy life, the universal rest for truth, and redemption. Now, in this way, we employ the injunction to remind Africans of the need to pay greater attention to their history and identity. Africa Know Thyself calls on Africans to recognize and grasp the distinctive particularity of their history as a people of equal ontological density and standing with the rest of the world. The injunction for me has political, moral, and epistemic significance to the very being of the African, in that it seeks not only to ground thinking on the concrete needs and aspirations of the people, but it also seeks to reignite the African power to believe. It urges Africans to take decisive steps to identify and pronounce their locus of annunciation, that is, who we are and from where we speak. And here I cite from Lucien. Now, in other words, due emphasis is placed on the fact that the African experience should be the primary source from which to understand and interpret its policies, history, politics, and philosophy. The journey of Africa's self-rediscovery entails reconciling Africans to Africanness and confronting the seductive lure of Eurocentric universalism. To know thyself, therefore, involves divesting Africans of the enduring effects of epistemic coloniality by instituting what Serge Bahan calls an emancipatory tradition and discourse. Serge Bahan, another prominent African philosopher, reminds us that since philosophic discourse originates from and is linked to the concrete conditions of existence and the life practices of the horizon out of which it is formulated, the proper task of philosophy in Africa is that of systematically elaborating a radical hermeneutics of the contemporary African situation. So in order to situate ourselves more satisfactorily in the social, political, and intellectual formation of the contemporary world, Africa has to understand their history, the circumstances that define who they are as a people. Part of this involves Africans repositioning themselves and the continent on the epistemic front, which is what I'm going to focus on. Now, let me move on to epistemic injustice. If the knowing subject, I'll begin with this quotation from Arkoff, Leader Arkoff. He says, if the knowing subject is the point of reference around which all knowledge claims revolve, what happens when the subject is only an indirect and long distance relation to its own here and now, or when it is an alienated account of its own reality? The result is that it can no longer serve as the reference point of knowledge or judge the adequacy of claims of justification. In actual fact, it no longer knows. Now, that statement for me sums up the predicament of the African. There is so much distance between the epistemic traditions in Africa and the African knowing subject. And reuniting these will reignite the African Renaissance on the knowledge front. Now, this problem confronting Africa on the epistemic train makes sense in our understanding of what I call the death of the African knowing subject. And so we need to examine the origins of the enemy called epistemic injustice, which has led to the death of the African knowing subject. Now, to achieve that, I turn my attention to Miranda Afrika's groundbreaking text, Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing. And I believe to know your enemy is half the problem. So if we define what it is, then we can be able to tackle it in the future. Now, although Afrika's work is situated within the Anglo-American philosophical context, the insights she draws find resonance across the world, including Africa. In fact, her work provides a valuable avenue through which to make sense of the epistemological lacuna that currently defines the continent. Afrika identifies two forms of epistemic injustice, which are testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice. Now, testimonial injustice occurs when prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word. Judgments on the credibility of particular individuals and what they say is severely affected by prejudice, be it gender, skin color, or any other social stereotype. For example, views that women, whatever they speak on, are dismissed because they are perceived as lacking in intellectual stamina. and the dismissal of views from blacks as irrational on account of their color. And she goes on to give the example of the policeman. In that case, I think it's white policeman because it's within the American context, who could not believe the story of a black man simply because that young man was black and he couldn't accept the account. The crucial point that I seek to make is that certain individuals and members of society are victims of an injustice called epistemic injustice as a result of being unfairly denied credibility on matters of knowledge and as a consequence of how they are framed by the dominant group in society. So testimonial injustice destroys the individual in their standing both as a knower and as a human being, because it is the capacity to know and to be recognized as such which concretizes our status as humans. On the measure of credibility, individuals or groups find themselves as either outside or inside the circle of epistemic privilege. Now, epistemic injustice of that nature, I think most of us have experienced it, or have actually perpetrated it against others within the scholarship. Say, anyway, what does he know? How can a traditionalist like that know anything? And dismissing the views of all women, and in a particular society so common. Now, hermeneutical injustice, the second form of injustice. This to me is one of the fundamental injustices that Africa has suffered. It is the injustice of having some significant area of one social experience obscured from collective understanding owing to persistent and wide-ranging hermeneutical marginalization. In other words, there are in existence social structures that create and sustain marginalization of specific groups of people by denying them the opportunity to contribute their experiences in the creation of shared meaning. In other words, hermeneutical injustice is perpetrated when the powerless groups are excluded from the epistemic practices that shape collective understanding. Now, Africa uses the example of sexual harassment as a phenomenon, which women struggled for centuries to name and have it criminalized. Because the power structure that favored patriarchy, which made it difficult to define that experience as evil. And I think the same thing happens in Africa about this kind of harassment, because most men don't believe just petting a woman is harassment. Why should you? Why not pat back if you are harassed? That has since changed, and I think at one moment, even when we were growing up, before we knew about homosexuality, if teachers grabbed you, a male teacher, and you report that your father man, they couldn't even identify it as sexual harassment if you were a boy, because there was nothing to define homosexuality in the open public. But today, if your kid comes back home and says, Mr. So-and-so is always staring at me, and he always grabs me and neck, the father will be quick to intervene, because he can see that there can be some kind of molestation of my kid. But when I went to school, nothing of that was known in society. So that hermeneutical understanding was not there in society. But now, the experiences of different people have now created an awareness, which we can now define as a certain kind of sexual orientation. Now, an analysis of these two forms of epistemic injustice reveals that Africa, in a fundamental sense, is a victim. And to illustrate the historic forms of epistemic injustice, I will draw just one or two examples from Kant, Hume, and Tembex, who is usually called the father of African philosophy. Now, Kant is a famous philosopher, and most people who have read Kant look at him as a pure philosopher, preoccupied with pure and colorblind philosophical themes. But they forget that amongst his works, he is one of the people who produced the most damaging theories of raciology. But the unfortunate thing is, this is an individual who never traveled outside his hometown. But he was capable of writing about everyone else, including Africans, from his hometown in Consequence. And he was known to be a loner. And so one wonders how he constructed those pictures of Africans. Now, on one occasion, because his city was close to the ocean, to the sea, he saw a black man being transported on the shores. And on setting sight on this black man, he said, this fellow was quite black from head to foot. A clear proof that what he said was stupid. Now, these views from Kant, for us and these other like-minded scholars, like you, Hegel, to maybe just a few, are the foundation out of which the so-called conventional conception of the African mentality were assembled. That is, a belief about the views of Africans and their rational incapabilities. Now, the credibility deficit declared on the man was declared on him because of his color and not on the basis of what he said. And that is epistemic injustice. Now we move fast forward to 1945. We have an anthropologist called Tempest, and he stated this famous claim. We do not claim, of course, that the Bantu are capable of formulating a philosophical treatise complete with adequate vocabulary. It is our job to proceed to such systematic development. It is we who will be able to tell them in precise terms what their innermost concept of being is. They will recognize themselves in our words and will acquiesce saying, you understand us, you know us completely, you know in the way we know. Now, if knowing requires resources of the mind, such as language to formulate propositions, concept to make sense of experience, procedures to approach the world, and standards to judge particular accounts of experience, then the Africans, in Temple's eyes, lacked all this, and so he had to provide for them. For me, that's the highest example of a hermeneutical injustice. Your own experiences are defined and described by somebody who doesn't understand them, and you are made to agree with their description. Now, Chavunduka and Ranger, these are famous scholars who most of us are familiar with, remind us of how colonial administrators and missionaries lumped together every supernatural manifestation and many natural ones as witchcraft, combining activities and ideas which had originally been not only separate but opposed. So the witch, the patient seeking relief, and the practitioner attempting a cure were all treated alike. They were all regarded by missionaries as worshippers of the devil. The overall effect was that all indigenous practices, whether nefarious or beneficial, ranging from religion, magic, sorcery, witchcraft, medicine, were grouped together as diabolical, and that became the predominant view. And most of us who have gone to school, probably from the pre-colonial to now, understand that anyone associated with traditional medicine for us is a witch. And we distrust those people. Now finally, let me come to what I call the reality of tomorrow. Now, the reality of tomorrow is what I believe is the Renaissance. As we reflect on the quest of African rights, the question that we should deal with today is how to release the future, which is shackled in the present, so that the true potential of the continent and its peoples can be realized. In other words, how can we uncover the wealth of African culture in its diverse forms, from ethics to politics, so that humanity can again flourish? Now, we take inspiration from Federico Meyer, former UNESCO Director General, submission that throughout the march of history, the endeavor to achieve a better tomorrow never stops. And the roadmap for such change starts from yesterday. And I believe this is what brings us together. Now, in epistemic terms, the reality of tomorrow should witness the success of rerouting the knowledge through all appropriate channels, including indigenous languages. We are aware that even within the West, the first group of scholars who elected to abandon Latin and chose to write in their vernacular languages were ridiculed and vilified by their own people who saw Latin as the language of nobility and scholarship. A similar reaction directed at those who champion African languages is witnessed today in Africa. But if they are to learn from the history of other cultures, then this is something they can overcome. Now, on the epistemic terrain, an African Renaissance requires addressing what we call the coloniality of knowledge. Coloniality of knowledge persists because of the existence of hermeneutical marginalization, which I defined. The last 3 points. There is definitely something that society can learn from the effectiveness of indigenous languages from the contemporary metaphysical landscape in Africa. Now, all of us know about religion, or have read about religion, or belong to various religions. Now, the translation of the key scriptural text into vernacular helped in the appropriation and unequivocal ownership of an otherwise alien religious system. Whether by design or not, the translation of the Bible handed the initiative to Africans, who through its mastery were quick to use it to their advantage in the fight for justice, contrary to the mentalities of those who had planned to use it as a pacifying agent. And I think most of you are familiar with black theology. It was simply because the Bible was translated into Shona, Ntebelo, or whatever, that now today most of our parents say, by tradition, we are Christians, right? And we live by Christian values. We have been Christians, and this is our Bible. They do so without any equivocation, because they now own it because it is accessible in their own language. Now, the same thing could not be done with science. If the basic text was translated right at the beginning, probably by now we would be owning science and saying to our people, by tradition, we are scientific. But because that knowledge has remained inaccessible, it remains an alien kind of knowledge. Now, saying this, I'm not being oblivious to what the linguists have warned against. I'm aware, of course, that most linguists have warned that African languages, as they are today, are invented colonial scripts, and therefore are in need of profound and systematic orthographic re-engineering. But what is of importance to me at this point is that I'm not so much interested in the origin or the nature of the language, but the hermeneutic importance of language in terms of defining interpretive schemes and frames of understanding, and language as a tool to fight continued epistemic injustice. And finally, it is within the promotion of African languages as a vehicle to transmit modern knowledge, and through effective translation, that the requiem for epistemic injustice shall be celebrated, for I believe it is nigh. In its place, we shall proclaim the restoration of Africa and the return of the African knowing subject. Thank you.
Asante sana, Mr. Mungoni. The next is Dr. Ajiza Abekular of the California State University. And the subject is U.S. foreign policy as an obstacle to a United States of Africa.
Good morning. Good morning. Okay, I want to first thank the organizers of Afrocentricity International for inviting me to speak today. I'll go right into the presentation, and then hopefully we'll have an opportunity to talk more afterwards. But my presentation, and I'm from San Diego State University, that's my institution, so I just wanted to quickly correct that. But I wanted to have this discussion, and this is actually a discussion that I had in Ghana at the Kwame Nkrumah conference. And it was a very interesting exchange at that particular conference on this very topic, and I'll reference that a little bit later. But when we talk about a United States of Africa and the challenges that face, Africa and African people, of course, we have to, provide a historical analysis and look to the Berlin Conference. And certainly the struggles and challenges that Africa faces, goes well beyond or before the Berlin Conference. But I think that, for the purposes of this conversation, that the Berlin Conference is a good starting point in that Western European powers convened to decide among themselves what part of Africa they would take. And, this great scramble for Africa ensued. And what we see now is an extension of that. There's this battle of the natural and mineral resources by these powerful Western European nations. And it's transformed Africa currently into a site of just pitiful exploitation. There are resource wars being conducted in Africa as we speak. The United States' supposed war on terror is the justification for and the foundation and the basis of U.S. foreign policy towards the continent of Africa. Rather, the United States engages itself militarily or have proxies fight its wars on its behalf. So the United States' policies towards Africa is all about supposedly the United States' security, but certainly about its continued economic development without any serious thought or considerations of how these policies would affect Africa or African people. Since the September 11th attacks on the United States, this so-called war on terror dominates the domestic and international policy circles, and thus removing any attentions to human rights related issues as they may affect poverty, women, children, etc. So nations like the United States, not just the United States, but really all of her allies, mainly seek to protect its own national interest abroad and install new regimes at the expense of African lives, property, and determination. So more or less, resource wars dominate the continent of Africa, leading to an increase in civil wars and interstate conflicts between neighboring countries. The United States has a very militarized foreign policy. And I should also say, before moving on, much of our discussion about the challenges that Africa face, they're certainly real, but they're theoretical. And they're theoretical in the sense, that we talk about European hegemony, and Eurocentrism, and how the African mind needs to be decolonized. And all of that is absolutely true. But part of the problem, also, and certainly Brother Vusi spoke to this, as well, just in case all of that other stuff, doesn't work, the United States has a military to obtain its objectives as well. So we have to be clear about that. So the United States takes on strategic and military policies towards Africa, which are manifested in programs like the African Command, or AFRICOM. And of course, the use of drone technology and counterterrorism. And I'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But the United States policies in Africa are focused on more, well, they say they're focused on issues of security. And of course, these ideas or these notions of security is really just a pretext for its economic agenda in Africa. And that's not to suggest that there aren't security concerns that all nations face, but we still know that that's just a pretext for what's really going on in Africa right now. So perhaps it's not in the interest of the United States, to advance and consistently support human rights agendas, because one of the things that happens, or one of, part of American rhetoric, is that much of their interest in Africa deals with human rights, supporting human rights, and providing support for African people. And certainly, you know, the United States says these things about other parts in the world that it plunders as well. But under the rubric of the war on terror, in 2011, the United States gave $260 million in military aid, supposedly to improve the overall professionalization of African militaries and enhance their ability to better respond to challenges such as peacekeeping, maritime security, and counterterrorism. Now, this is important because since the fall of Libya, the United States military is now present in at least 50 African countries. Before the fall of Libya, it was less than 15. You know, so in a very short period of time, the Obama administration has been able to fully infiltrate, in terms of its military, the continent of Africa. So one of the things that the United States also says in terms of its foreign policy is to offer major support for peacekeeping efforts in Africa. So places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somalia, South Sudan, and there are many other so-called peacekeeping operations that they're involved in, but these peacekeeping operations often have a result of further destabilizing a country or a region. Now, I'd like to talk about Uganda. It's not really a case study, but it's an example I'd like to use. The discovery of what might be Africa's what might be Africa's largest oil reserve in Uganda coincided with the deployment of U.S. Special Forces there. And of course, it's no coincidence that what might be the largest oil reserve in Africa was accompanied with U.S. Special Forces. So in 2011, the Obama administration sent 100 well-armed Special Forces advisors, they call them, to the region, allegedly to assist the Ugandan government in apprehending Joseph Kony. And of course, at the time, and I learned this from the CIA. I mean, I don't have a direct line to the CIA, but it's public information. But the CIA had concluded that Joseph Kony was not even in Uganda and was probably in the Central African Republic. In any event, in addition to these special forces, the United States has provided tens of millions of dollars in military aid to Uganda. And it should be noted that Uganda has troops fighting the United States proxy war in Somalia under the auspices of the African Union. Okay, so that's a very important part of U.S. foreign policy and their activities in that particular region. But ironically, Uganda represents probably one of the best examples of the inconsistencies between the United States rhetoric on African affairs and its actual policies. The United States has aligned itself with one of the most abusive regimes in Africa. But what must also be understood, and I'll say this and then I'll explain it in just a moment, but what must also be understood is that thousands of child soldiers fought under the current president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, when he was the leader of the rebel movement in the 1980s. And the reason why I mention that is because part of the justification for going after America's boogeyman at the time, Joseph Kony, was that he was recruiting all of these child soldiers. And in the 26 or 28 years now that Museveni has clung to power, Amnesty International has implicated his government in numerous human rights violations. So, of Uganda, Amnesty International wrote, referring to the rape, torture, executions, that the country's security forces regularly use lethal force, especially during political demonstrations. Opposition politicians, their supporters, and some journalists face harassment, beatings, and arrest. The Ugandan military, despite efforts by key donor countries to professionalize them, has yet to address the severe due process violations in military courts, especially the prosecution of civilians who should be tried in civilian courts. Torture in detention is endemic, with torturers rarely brought to justice. Uganda is notorious. Okay, that's it. All right. So, again, I talk about that only to highlight the inconsistencies or the hypocrisy and contradictions of U.S. foreign policy in Africa. In a 1985 television interview, Museveni was being interviewed, and he touted his use of child soldiers, claiming that the custom of using children as soldiers was African tradition. And he unrepentantly defended the practice and proudly paraded boys seemingly as young as 10 years old before the camera. And I've seen this interview myself. It's on YouTube. And again, I highlight the example again to demonstrate, this hypocrisy of American foreign policy. The International Criminal Court, which many of you probably realize is a court that was created, specifically to target Africans. And the International Criminal Court and the Obama administration have jointly worked on formalizing charges against not only Joseph Coyne, but others as well. But Joseph Coyne is at the top of the most wanted list of the International Criminal Court. Now let's talk a little bit more about AFRICOM. And the stated mission of AFRICOM is to protect and defend the national security interest of the United States by strengthening the defense capabilities of African states and regional organizations, and, when directed, conduct military operations in order to deter and defeat transnational threats and to provide a security environment conducive to good governance and development. AFRICOM, it further maintains, or this so-called African Command, that it seeks to encourage African militaries to operate under civilian authority, respect the rule of law, abide by international human rights norms, and contribute to stability in their respective states. And of course, this is interesting to borrow from Martin Luther King, in that the United States is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. Certainly that hasn't changed since the time Martin Luther King said it until today. But in reality, it's really clear that the United States is boldly attempting to dislodge and disrupt China's presence and growing influence in Africa. At play here is a competition for African resources between China and the United States. China has billions of dollars in African investments and projects, and standing as a symbol of the ties between Africa and China is the recently unveiled, within the last couple of years, African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. China gifted the AU this massive $200 million structure. Now, the chairperson of the African Union, sister from South Africa, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, what is today, the 22nd? 23rd. 2 days ago, on the 21st, she said that the strong relations between Africa and China would help build the Africa we want. I mean, imagine the idea that China will help Africa build the Africa that we want. And this notion, it's that notion among us that makes Pan-Africanism and the idea of the United States of Africa so painfully elusive. But I digress. African leaders welcome China's economic influence and point to their Asian partners' willingness to invest in the critical areas of energy, telecom, technology, and infrastructure. Now, the rivalry between China and the United States and Africa is reminiscent of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States that played out on this continent in the 1960s. China has just replaced the Soviet Union. Most notably referring to that Cold War, which played out in Africa, Patrice Lumumba and Kwame Nkrumah were casualties of this war. The latter was deposed in a CIA-backed military coup, and the former was assassinated by US and Belgian and United Nations-backed factions. Both countries, Ghana and DRC, had and still have vast mineral wealth that the West covets, and China. And both leaders, by no coincidence, were nationalists in their political orientation. Now in 2011, Libya became the victim of AFRICOM's first successful military campaign. Libya posing absolutely no threat to the United States national security. Libya was also the most stable, one of the most stable and wealthiest countries in Africa, and it was reduced to rubbles, and it's still in rubbles. The United States, using the United Nations responsibility to protect mandate, passed a resolution, 1973, imposing a no-fly zone in Libya. Again, the idea was to, a responsibility to protect. The UN justified the US-sponsored resolution by claiming that Libyan forces were attacking civilian protesters. And no evidence of that has ever been produced. But this no-fly zone morphed into a bombing campaign of both military and civilian targets on day one. The US and NATO forces aligned themselves with al-Qaeda-affiliated rebels and eventually toppled the government and assassinated its leader, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Now, the irony of that is that the United States was and is fighting al-Qaeda in Iraq, but aligned itself with al-Qaeda in Libya. China, which had millions of dollars in oil investments in Libya, staunchly opposed this imperial intervention for its own benefit, of course. But both Russia and China made errors in not, they abstained from that UN vote rather than voting it down or vetoing it. Thank you. The Libyan National Transitional Council, something that NATO created, promised oil contracts to the nations that assisted them in this civil war and promised to shun those who refused. China is no longer operating in Libya. So when the larger economic and military imperatives of the United States are understood, it becomes apparent that the United States military intervention in Africa has little to do with combating terrorism and ensuring human rights. And Joseph Coyne then becomes the convenient scapegoat, as one example, to justify America's imperialist ambitions. And of course, Gaddafi was one of those scapegoats and boogeymen as well. The International Criminal Court and the Obama administration should be roundly criticized for their support of an alliance with such a brutal regime as Uganda, and also their alliances with al-Qaeda. The government is responsible for countless atrocities against civilians and other problems. Now, Dr. Gumede made some very good points that really transitions well into this presentation, or perhaps my presentation would transition well into his. So when we talk about many of these issues, African leadership should absolutely be based on Afrocentric orientations. And there needs to be a critical consciousness, not only among political leadership, but Africa in general, or Africans in general. But U.S. foreign policy towards Africa cannot be determined by corporate interests that fail to address the fundamental realities of African societies and conflicts. Africans must develop a continent-wide policy to address the pressing issues of the continent. The policy must also address how Africa interacts with the rest of the world. Africa must recognize that the policies of rich countries, the G8 and the G20, have had a profound and negative impact on Africa. Chinese, American, and European policies toward Africa are in their own interest and not in the interest of Africa. African countries are told to follow policies for their development that these countries themselves did not follow. They became rich by very different historical realities. How can Nigeria, for example, with one of the largest oil reserves in the world, be among the poorest countries in the world? How can Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, two of the largest cocoa producers, have no say whatsoever in the price of cocoa on the global market? Furthermore, why is the issue of corruption and bad governance in Africa and elsewhere absent a discussion of the rich countries and their corporations' facilitation of said corruption? Therefore, when we engage in dialogue about global governance, it cannot be in the context of how Africa can fit in to such conversations held by the G8. Rather, Africa has to chart a new course and follow its own path based on the needs of its people. Africa must engage the world on its own terms. The G8 and the G20, after all, do not represent Africa. They represent the 8th and 20th wealthiest nations in the world. The reality is, however, that there will always be conflict when there is such an inequality and oppression in the world. Whenever Africa has to negotiate with the world over its own resources, there will be conflict. Whenever nationalists, liberals, progressives talk about an unequal distribution of wealth, there will be conflict. Africans should not have to enter into discussions about unequal distributions of wealth. It's a false premise. Why should Nigerian oil finance the American elite? Why should South African diamonds finance the education of the British elite? Why should the world share in the natural wealth, for example, of the Democratic Republic of Congo? It's their wealth. They can and should decide whom they want to share it with or whether to share it at all. In everything we must do, in conclusion, when it comes to Africa, we must do what is in the best interest of Africa. A basic and simple idea. We cannot represent Western governments and represent Africa at the same time. The interests of the United States, for example, are diametrically opposed to the interest of Africa. We cannot be advocates for Africa on the one hand and do the bidding of Western governments on the other. When international organizations and the war machines of Western regimes wage unprovoked and unjustified criminal wars in Libya based on distortions and fabrications, or subvert the constitutional process in Cote d'Ivoire and collaborate in the overthrow of that government, we must stand firm with Africa and not only condemn these motives and destructive actions, but help create a strategy to prevent such actions in the future. So we must strengthen these ties by advocating for Africa and not representing those who wish to continue to exploit Africa. We cannot allow ourselves to be the smiling black faces of corrupt and morally bankrupt economic and military policies in Africa. We should also honor Africa by being principled and by being honest with Africa. We should avoid congratulating regimes in Africa just for merely holding elections. We're not doing Africa any favors by ignoring the need for serious reform in Africa and not reforming Africa into the image of Europe. We should support a reform that encourages the aspirations of African people, a reform that respects, honors, and celebrates the cultural traditions of Africa, and a reform that sustains the continent and her people, and not a continent whose resources are the lifeblood of the entire world, all while the people of Africa suffer. Finally, Africans in the diaspora cannot be used as tools by African governments to gain access to Western capital. To strengthen, the strength of our bond lies in our sacred cultural and historical legacies. We must cherish and nurture that bond, and it will forever be strong. And I feel like with that last statement, I have to provide some context. A few years ago, myself and some others were invited to Senegal by then President Abdoulaye Wade to take part in a seminar on global governance, he called it, which sounded initially like a great idea, I suppose, but it was absent a real discussion about what caused corruption in Africa. It was almost as if, Africans were off in their little corner being corrupt all by themselves, and that Europeans were not involved in that process. But then I later learned that it really wasn't even about, global governance, but it was about inviting African American, educators, business leaders, and politicians to Senegal as a gateway to further ingratiate itself with the United States government or with the Obama administration. And it had nothing to do with why we were invited. So I just felt that I had to offer, that, context, that this was not a blanket, criticism of Africans in general. In any event, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adisa, Dr. Adisa. Africa for Africans, by Africa.